All right, so when I looked at the essential question, it was a little bit difficult for me because I am not in a school setting continuously. I work kind of on the side of trying to provide the professional development to get teachers to use data for continuous improvement, um, focused on closing gaps. But when I read the article, it was really helpful because it reminded me of a district that I'm currently in. So I'm going to kind of reflect on what I've done with them and where they're headed in terms of using data to try to close the gap. So the eCart setup that was in Closing the Gap, the journal article, where it talked about really specific um, Virginia state standards of learning. So I'm assuming that's their state standards and district approved curriculum materials. They combined all kind of into one place, and they started using that to create really a culture of assessment and instruction that was targeted to those assessments, and really tried to focus in on what the needs of the students were through the standards. And that's a different world than what most of our schools do. Most of our schools use normative assessments to determine, like a MAP or FastBridge, AimsWeb, whatever, Dibbles, to determine needs for intervention. And so they wanted to go to a standards-based intervention approach. And so I'm particularly in math. And so what we actually did, and I just printed off one example. I don't know if you can see this very well, but it's so this would be like standard 5 NBT1. We actually went through and based on their power standards, figured out what standards influence which standards. And so they actually have maps that go all the way back to kindergarten. And so and we have quick assessments for each standard. And they're going through and they're finding, like, they're following strands back and finding places to intervene. And then they use 30 minutes a day, separate from core, that they'll go, and say, hey, this group needs work with second grade place value. And so that's what they'll work on. And then if you saw, the district went in then and put like their actual curriculum for that topic. So if you were intervening on 5 MBT1, here's the curriculum you'd use. And so really, the eCart was encouraging for me to read about because it's kind of a similar setup to what we're trying to do in the school district. And we just have started. I just have done some first site visits actually last week and this week to see how the grouping and sorting is going. And um, it's been really interesting. So uh, obviously the desired outcome is the mastery of those of specific standards as opposed to just more general math interventions. So mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, so actually, it does make sense. And we have one of my site visits, I was dealing with some second grade teachers, and they said there was some tears shed because they found out so many of their kids were still back at the kindergarten level. And so they followed that path back in assessments and found these kids really need some basic numeracy still. And so that's what they're intervening on. Did that answer your question? Is that what you were asking? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and that is the concern because we go back and we've tried to minimize it as much as possible. The nice part is there's crucial standards that flow to almost every future standard. And so once I've done that back mapping once, it actually sets me up pretty well for most of the year because those same kind of core standards, like counting and cardinality in kindergarten, the numbers in base 10 through first and second grade. I mean, operations and algebraic thinking, those are always going to be the big influencers. And so once you've back mapped once, you've probably back mapped for most of your power standards moving forward. So initially it's kind of a big load to get set up, but once you're going, I think it'll be a lot less. Yeah. Hmm. Yep. Yeah. Absolutely. Hmm. Hmm. Yes. So most of our schools do what's called a walk-to intervention model, and so what that means is across grade levels we share kids so we can get more interventionists at play, and so there might be one enrichment group with across two or three grades, and then the rest of them are saying, okay, I've got this cluster, I've got this cluster, and you bring paras and instructional aides on board too. And one school we visited was awesome, even within just their own grade. They have like they have three teachers, but they had eight groups going because they had paras and instructional aides just in with them on it. So it was really cool to watch. Hmm. What was the program? Hmm. Yeah. Hmm. The big there have been schools that have kind of thought about that model. The concern with that is if you take away core instruction, you always should have two goals, right? We want to meet the kid where they're at, but we also want to close the gap. And so if I allow kids to just lower their grade level and try, like, let's say one of your third graders is at a second grade level, right? So we just put him at second grade for the year. Well, the next year at best he's at a third grade level, right? And so you've got to the kind of the balancing act there is saying, okay, let's focus on the standards that actually have an impact later on. And so if we've got that kid who's still struggling with some second grade content, let's focus on the content that's going to be important to fourth grade. That way we can close the gap so he can be with back up with his peers in fourth grade and cut our losses on maybe some of the standards that aren't as impactful. Does that make sense? This one is just this district has just started with math. We haven't seen a school district do it standards based with reading yet. So yeah, it's kind of a different cat, that's for sure. I do. So it's a little bit about this, but also like about my role in general. In terms of professional development and or data, what kind of professional development or presentation of data is the most, do you feel like is most impactful to actually changing your instruction? Mm, yeah. Yeah. Right. Mm, okay. Okay. Hmm. Yeah. I think that's helpful, because even on our site visits, Daniel, you asked earlier, what's the workload for a teacher? I mean, it is fairly significant. And when I'm thinking about actually changing that behavior, when we went through site visits, there was definitely some schools that were like, we just needed more time to just digest the different steps. There's a lot of steps here. And so that helps me to hear that just from you guys in the field as well, to know that when I'm planning these trainings, to really allow for that time to just digest it with their collaborative and or building leadership team, and think about their next steps. So yeah, it's helpful. All right.